So, first of all, thank you all for showing up to our award ceremony here. Hopefully most of you that participated are still able to be around for this. For those of you that weren't and are wondering what in the world is Iron Author, it was a 2-hour speedwriting contest that we held earlier in the day. Contestants were given 3 prompts and 2 hours to try and write the best story they could. The 3 prompts that they were given earlier in the day were that they had to write a story that significantly involved hippogriff culture, society, or history, a rare fruit, and an artistic hobby or career. We got a wide variety of stories of all genres. It was kind of crazy how many people participated. We had 41 submitted entries, and all 41 of those people actually did all the reviews that were necessary for each of their fellow peers' stories in order to remain eligible for the final round. After all those scores were submitted, we looked at the top 10 as a judging panel, and I want to give a shout out to my staff who helped me judge this. Bubblebean, Titanium Dragon, and Winston all were a big help. We all read those final 10 stories and had to pick the top 3 out of that. So we were really rushed for those past couple hours reading right up into the deadline here. So there are prizes that are going to be given out. They're going to be Amazon e-gift cards. As I mentioned at the start of the contest earlier today, if you are a winner, I'll get in touch with you over the next day or so, and we can figure out if you're in a different country, not the U.S., if there's an Amazon store that's local to you, we can try and make sure that it's an e-gift card that'll work best in your country and stuff, so we can work on that. But yeah, first place is $25, second place is $20, and third place is $15. So, as we're all here for one thing and one thing only, let's get to the top 3 stories. We're going to start, of course, with third place, and in third place, drumroll, is... where's the right button? There we go. Remember by Schattendash, which I am not pronouncing that correctly, so I apologize. That said, this story was one that was sort of militaristic in nature in that it was about, it felt like it really fit on Memorial Day, I'll put it that way. It was a little slow to start, but had, in my opinion, was a really heartwarmingly earnest scene by the end that just really sort of brought out the best of some symbolism and Memorial Day and history in the past. So, without further ado, I'm going to read this story to all of y'all, and then we will go on to the next story after that. So, Remember by Schattendash. Trying again. It was a windy day traversing the waterfall spires, and Rintarith was starting to regret not planning appropriately. He knew that most hippogriffs chose to use their sea forms to swim for the waterfalls, or fly up and save themselves the most energy, but that didn't feel right to Rintarith. He knew the importance of the holiday, and he was not going to take the easy way, not knowing when he knew what he did about the history of today. Looking ahead, Rintarith saw a small indent on the side of the mountain he was climbing, and picked up his pace to get out of the freezing wind. When he arrived, he sat back on his haunches and dropped the pack he had been carrying with a loud thud. He then leaned back against the side of the mountain and catch his breath for a few seconds. He had been hiking this trail for the last 4 hours, traversing massive streams formed from the waterfalls and going up switchbacks that he could swear were at 45-degree angles. In all, he felt like every muscle in his body was on fire, and his lugs were only inflating partially. He was miserable, but he knew he had to do this. For his grandfather. He had promised his grandfather he was going to make the trek up the spires today, following the exact path he detailed. He owed him that. Feeling his throat screaming at him for not having had anything to drink in far too long, Rintarith unhooked a canteen from the side of his rucksack and began to greedily drink from it. The water tasted less than ideal, mostly chalky, but that was to be expected given that he had been filling the canteen from the water from the falls here. The water was alkaline due to all the minerals in the rocks that made up the mountains. While it was almost crystal clear due to the lack of any organic life growing in it, when you tasted how basic the water was, it became quite clear why that was. When Rintarith finished off the last of his water flask and felt like he had recovered enough to continue on, he grabbed hold of his pack, clipped the canteen back on, threw it back on, and continued up the trail. As he was walking, Rintarith couldn't help but internally praise the fact that the trail he was taking was along the western side for most of the length, and that he was doing this in the morning, so he didn't have to contend with the sun trying to cook him as he ascended. After a few hundred meters, he came across a small waterfall that was hugging the side of the mountain and forming a small pond in the middle of the trail. He unhooked his canteen from the side of his pack, undid the cap, and held it under the water. As he was doing this, Rintarith looked up and towards the top of the mountain. It looked to him like he only had about 15 minutes left to his trek, And based on all the hippogriffs he was seeing landing and taking off, he knew this wasn't just another false top. When Rintrith felt his canteen begin to overflow, he removed it from the water, put the cap back on, reaffixed it to his rucksack, and picked up the pace to reach the top. As he was walking up the trail, he began to notice more and more holes and gashes in the granite of the mountain. Huge circular pits, large enough to almost be mistaken for caves, and gashes deep and wide enough that many served as nests for large birds of prey, covered the sides and the trail. He had reached the top. After about 5 minutes of walking past all of this, and on many occasions having to jump over the gashes and pits, Rinturith crested the edge of the top and finally saw the top of the mountain. It was a gorgeous sight. Almost the entire top was covered in a strange grassy moss, and what wasn't covered in moss was covered in a massive lake of water, with a geyser of water constantly shooting up at its center. This was Mount Wexnall, the only one of the waterfall spires to have a lake at its top. However, along the shore of this lake stood the one thing that held more significance than any lake ever could. A single mangled tree, one that looked like it had suffered through a devastating blight and never recovered, hung halfway out into the water in a way that suggested it would fall in at any moment. It was a finneran tree, a species that only grew on top of these mountains and produced a fruit once a year, and for a week. On the grassy moss, dozens of griffin and hippogriff families sat and chatted amongst themselves. Some even were out on the lake swimming around. Everyone was talking in hushed voices, giving the air a tranquil quality to it, with only the whistling of the wind being louder. But all this was not why Wintereth had hiked several kilometers with only a rucksack and an old canteen. He had a purpose for being here, and he was going to fulfill it. Rinturith began walking over to the grizzled tree in solemn silence. He passed family after family of hippogriffs and griffins and quietly apologized for disturbing them. When he arrived at the tree, he slowly removed his rucksack, set it down beside the tree, and opened it up. He then began to remove small items wrapped in cloth. When all 30 of these cloth-covered items were removed, he began to unwrap them, revealing intricately carved granite sculptures. Each one was done using painstaking detail and the utmost care, and all unique. This had been the reason his grandfather had asked him to do this, to bring them here in his stead and drop them into the lake. After more than 40 years, his grandfather had finally collected enough stones from Mount Wexnall and carved them into something that resembled the hippogriff he had served with in the Hippogriff-Griffin War. Grandpa Sand had been a lieutenant in the Battle of Mount Wexnall and had lost 30 of his brothers in the most destructive fight of the war. Thousands of bombs, both magical and traditional, had been lobbed at this mountain, all in an effort to eliminate every hippogriff that was stationed here. It was the reason why there was a lake. It was the result of thousands of pounds of ordnance exploding and carving out a massive hole on top of the mountain. Grandpa never talked about what had happened then, only that he saw more than half his brothers die here, and he never slept right after that. The reason everyone was here now was to honor the end of that war, the signing of the Waterfall Accord here on this very mountain. His grandfather had wanted to come, as he had every year since then, but after a diagnosis of cancer less than a year ago, and his hospitalization and death not even a month later, he had entrusted the task to him. It was why he had hiked the trail rather than fly or swim. Grandpa Sand and his men had been pushed up the mountain on that very trail by the Griffin army, unable to fly for risk of being killed on sight. Rinturith picked up a carving, one of an oyster of pearl with the name Private Yentar, number 879865, age 17, carved into it. He then walked over to the lake and dropped the carving into it, right beneath the tree. He repeated this with carving after carving, letting each one sink into the clear, still waters, never to be seen again. When the last of the carvings was deposited, Rinturith pulled out a bottle of Griffin bourbon, a bottle his grandfather had received from a major of the Griffin army on the day of the Accord, and had been planning to finally open today, and laid it down on the ground. Rinturith then flew up to the tree and picked a single fruit from the tree. As a descendant of a hippogriff that defended this mountain, he was one of the few who were permitted to do so. His grandfather had instructed him to do this to taste the fruit of the tree he had fought to defend in that war, to honor what he had done. Rinturith then flew back down and set the fruit down beside the bourbon. He lifted up the bottle, retrieved a corkscrew from his bag, and opened the bottle. After doing this, Rinturith took a small sip of the ancient drink. While he wasn't a fan of hard liquor, seeing as the alcohol burned his mouth and throat, he had to admit it had a pleasant taste, a strange mix of spicy and sweet. He then put the bottle down and picked up the fruit and looked at it. It reminded him of a pear, only bigger and purple. Thankful that he was finally going to taste the fruit his grandfather had every year, he bit into the fruit, expecting to taste something more pleasant than the bourbon. He was met with a sour, bitter flavor that lingered on the tongue and throat and killed off any remaining flavor from the drink he had just had. So, thank you to Rinturith for that. As I mentioned, that was the third place story. So I'll be in touch in the next day or so with your prizes and information on that. Or if I don't, please feel free to reach out to me. Once again, I'm Xepher, the running lead here. So let's go for our next story. Our number 2 story is going to be The Rarest Fruit by Delta Sierra. All right. So I believe this story was rather long. It had a lot of minor typos because of that. Almost every story in this entry did, though, so no one should feel bad about not being able to get their final editing pass in. That was very, very common. I think this story had a very strong arc throughout things. It really has a nice setup with a problem, a quest, and an eventual solution. I love some of the wordplay and pun stuff here, and I won't say any more because that will be spoilers. But the ending has a nice little punch to it that makes me smile. So here we go. Second place in Iron Author, The Rarest Fruit by Delta Sierra. Pom trudged through the park, her head held low and her wings held tight against her body. The sound of summer drifted around her. Laughter, splashes from the young hippogriffs in the park's pond, the occasional happy shout. The scents of flowers and fresh food wafted through the air, tugging visitors back and forth across the park's paved paths. But Pom was lost in her own world, oblivious to everything around her. Why can't I do it? Why can't I transform? Pom's life was normal, for the most part. A stable family, mom and dad and 2 sisters, one older, one younger. Reasonable, if a bit underwhelming in her studies, balanced by a substantial circle of friends. She was a bit slow to fully develop, but not unusually so. She actually beat most of her peers into the air. One of her happiest memories was of her parents watching her from the ground and cheering her on as she took to the skies for the first time. The trouble had started when she tried, and tried, and tried, to transform from her terrestrial form into her aquatic form. When her peers all passed her up, she tried even harder. The transformation was never forced on children, but after her younger sister managed the transformation on her own for the first time, Pom's parents were forced to admit their middle daughter had a problem. For her part, Pom tried until her head swam and her jaw ached from clenching her teeth. She never succeeded. Initially, Pom's parents tried to keep the issue private. They took Pom to several healers who tried treatments ranging from traditional hippogriff remedies to modern magical treatments. They even engaged a traveling unicorn healer, at a hideous cost, as Pom later discovered. All were unable to help their daughter. They tried spiritual, magical, and medical approaches, but all were unsuccessful. Eventually, Pom could no longer hide her plight from her friends and teachers, and her affliction became known to the general public. Various self-proclaimed experts came forth with suggestions, but of the few that were actually viable, none worked. After some time, Pom's parents visited Queen Novo's court, with Pom in tow. The young hippogriff was a sorry sight, disheveled, ungroomed, eyes bleary with stress and lack of sleep. Queen Novo's personal healers attended to Pom, but for all their experience, they were no more successful than those who had tried before. However, another group in Queen Novo's court had an answer, albeit a partial one. The court scholars believed the solution lay in ancient descriptions of hippogriffs with similar afflictions. Although the ability to transform between terrestrial and aquatic forms was the hippogriff birthright, some were occasionally born without the ability, or rather, with the ability suppressed by natural inhibitors. The condition was not common, but it was documented in some of the older texts. The scholars were proud of their ability to read these texts and were eager to showcase their skills. The cure to Pom's affliction seemed to be a rare fruit. Unfortunately, the fruit itself was not described, or rather poorly described. The scholars knew it was red and hard to find, but they had no other information. Undeterred, Queen Novo sent emissaries to the great nations of Equestria. They left as a great group, dozens strong, with crowds cheering their departure. For weeks, the hippogriffs cheered their leader and the concern she showed to even the most ordinary of her citizens. Pom's friends assured her that she would soon have a cure and told her not to worry. Her parents, although a bit more guarded, were also optimistic. They tried to maintain a calm facade, but Pom could see the hope in their expressions when they thought she wasn't looking. The emissaries returned in 1s and 2s. First back was the emissary to the Ponylands. He brought back Zap apples, harvested fresh and preserved in glass jars. Although they tickled Pom's mouth and throat, she didn't notice any other changes. The Zap apples were delicious and the jars were pretty, but as a cure they were ruled ineffective. Next to return were the 2 emissaries sent to the Dragonlands, for even in those peaceful days a single hippogriff wandering the Dragonlands alone might disappear without a trace. They bore fiery red ruby fruits plucked from scalding magma fields by heavily armored dragons. The fruits had to be ground into a powder and mixed with water so Palm could get them down, but they had no effect aside from a slightly gritty aftertaste. The emissary from Yakistan returned missing the tip of her ear due to frostbite. However, she was also successful in finding a rare fruit, in this case a leathery shelled melon with red and green veins. When the melon was cracked open in Queen Novo's court, the smell drove the hippogriffs from the room. After that, the queen decreed that future donations should be examined outside the palace. Despite the powerful smell, the melon lacked the power to cure Palm. The emissary to the buffalo brought back a small bag of dried red berries. The berries had long been used in traditional healing poultices and potions in the buffalo tribes, and Queen Novo's scholars were particularly excited about these dried fruits. Palm dutifully ate the sour red berries and was rewarded with nothing more than a stomach cramps and a rash. More emissaries returned, and the spirits of the hippogriffs rose and fell with each fruit they presented to Palm. The zebras, griffins, and Kirin all sent various rare fruits, but none of them worked. Even the diamond dog sent a rare fruit, although after inspecting the strange spongy growth, the scholars suggested that ingesting it would be fatal, ill-advised, and possibly fatal. By now, Palm was known across Equestria, not just among the hippogriffs, but among the other races scattered across the land. Every race wanted to be the one to deliver a cure for the poor young hippogriff. Eventually, the last emissary returned empty-handed after wandering the ever-free forest for nearly 2 months. Palm's family hadn't given up hope, but the rest of the nation had. They turned their attention to other matters. It was sad, but nothing could be done for the young hippogriff. Heroic efforts had been made, of course, because hippogriff culture was based around helping others. But everything that could have been done had been done. Palm, once the center of attention, was largely forgotten. The scholars and healers occasionally dropped in with a new theory or potion or magic ward, but they invariably did nothing. So Palm wandered the park near her home, dejected. She paused for a moment to watch a father and daughter playing at the edge of the pond. The father would scoop the young hippogriff up, launch into the air, and hurl her into the water. Before she hit the water, she would transform effortlessly into her aquatic form and let the momentum from the drop propel her deep below the pond's surface. When she resurfaced, laughing, she would swim back to the edge of the pond, transforming back to her four-legged form as she reached the shore. Her father was there to meet her, and the cycle would begin again. Palm gritted her teeth as she watched the young hippogriff's form flick back and forth. Feelings of jealousy swirled at the back of her mind. She tried to transform again, already resigned to her failure. Sure enough, there was the barest flicker, and then nothing. Sighing loudly, Palm retreated to the park bench located nearby. Unlike the other benches around the pond, this one faced away from the water and towards a natural hummock near the entrance of the park. Scattered trees dotted the hill, but the eye was drawn toward the ancient ruins near the top of the small hill. Palm had once heard the scholars talking about the ruins. Apparently they were actually the cellar of an old tower that had once stood on a much taller hill. A hippogriff experimenter lived there until one of his experiments went awry and vaporized most of the tower and a good portion of the hill as well. Unable to prosecute the experimenter, who was finally distributed through the atmosphere in the immediate area, the king at the time decreed the land became the property of the public. The pond was rumored to be a crater formed by the mad experimenter as well, although nobody could verify that claim. Distracted by her musings, Palm failed to notice the approach of another hippogriff until he sat on the other end of the bench. Startled, she whipped her head around to glare at the intruder. Expecting an unruly child or condescendingly sympathetic adult, she was surprised to find she was sharing the bench with a hippogriff about her own age. Her glare softened a bit as she locked eyes with the newcomer. "I hope you don't mind if I join you. This is my favorite bench." Palm shrugged. "Sure, fine with me. It's a public park." Completely failing to notice her dismissive tone of voice, the newcomer kept on talking. "I like to come here and look at the tower. Or, well, what's left of it. You get the idea. Do you know the foundation's over 100 years old? Imagine what life was like back then. This whole area was underground, for one thing. Oh, and of course there were more trees and fewer buildings, but that's probably for the best since the original owner of the tower was a bit crazy. Things tended to explode or catch on fire in the immediate area. By the way, my name is Darisol. Nice to meet you. I don't think I've seen you around this park before, but I'm usually over here by the ruins. Most of the others tend to hang out near the pond or the food stalls at the flower beds. Isn't that funny?" Palm managed to keep a straight face, but internally she rolled her eyes. Great, a talker, and he wonders why he never meets anyone at the park. They probably flee as soon as they see him coming. Pushing those uncharitable thoughts aside, Palm interrupted her new companion with a question. "So you're a history buff then?" "Oh, yes, absolutely. I work on rare manuscripts professionally, you know. They have to be cleaned up every so often, and of course we try and recover and preserve old manuscripts, and they need to be copied so they can be distributed for general use. Although, funny enough, most other hippogriffs don't really seem interested in reading them, so we don't have to make too many copies. I usually spend most of my time reading through the extremely old documents. I do some manuscript illustration on the side, just for fun, you know. Darasol kept talking, and Palm felt her eyes glazing over. Mountains rose and crumbled. The sea swallowed up the earth, and then receded. Odd, four-finned fish wandered into the sand and slowly transformed into things that looked like hippogriffs and ponies and griffins. The sun died, and the pony princesses fashioned a new one from spare bits and pieces. And it was odd. I told them the translation for rare fruit was incorrect, but they didn't believe me. And of course you know how it is. When it's your word against 3 senior scholars, you won't stand a chance. But then again, Say that again? What? Darasol asked, a confused expression on his face. The bit about the rare fruit. Say that again? Palm's intensity was making Darasol nervous. He swallowed and cleared his throat. Well, so it was an extremely old manuscript, and the generally accepted translation was rare fruit. But I knew that couldn't be correct, because the diphthong was in the wrong place, and anyway, it's an older dialect where the word order has... Palm held up a claw, and Darasol actually took the hint and shut his mouth. She rummaged around in her bag and came up holding a piece of paper. Is this the translation? Palm asked. She handed the paper to Darasol, who squinted at the paper for a moment before nodding. Sure is. Of course, as I said, it's not correct because the contextual issues here. Then what's the correct translation? Darasol fidgeted for a moment under her gaze before replying. It's tomato. The phrase translates as tomato. Palm gave him a blank gaze, so he went on. You know, tomatoes? They were common in this area decades ago, although they became a lot less popular after we came back out of the ocean. Before that, they were a delicacy. But not rare? Palm asked. No, not rare. See, the confusion here is actually because of this is a bit of a joke. Tomatoes are technically a fruit, but most creatures refer to them as vegetable. So in the context, it would be the rarest fruit, because although it is a fruit, no one ever calls it one. Funny enough, Where can I find a tomato? Interrupted Palm, who had never tried one. Oh, well, I actually have one right here, Darasol beamed, reaching into his bag. I brought it for my lunch, but if you want to try one, you're welcome to it. They're not my favorite, but they do have a unique taste that's quite unlike most of the food we have here. Palm reached out with a trembling claw and took the ripe red fruit from Darasol. She gazed at it for a moment before savagely biting into the strange fruit. 2 more bites finished it off, stem and all. Unnoticed, a thin stream of sweet red juice ran out from the corner of her mouth and dripped slowly onto the ground. Darasol looked a bit perplexed, but rallied. All right. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Although, usually I cut mine into bits and savor it, and you're not really supposed to eat the stem? Hey, what are you doing? Palm flopped onto the ground, her legs and wings replaced with fins. She looked up at Darasol. Darasol? Yes. Shut up and push me into the water. So yeah, I love the pun at the end of that one. Someone actually picked up on I almost gave away the game when I said something about, like, you could use a tomato as a fruit because I said a rare fruit and tomatoes are etc. So I was glad someone had the same thought. So I like that one. I thought it was a cute little ending on that. So congratulations again to Delta Sierra for the silver place. All right, I need a sip of water here before we go to our final one. Give me 1 second. Just checking the audience channels here real quick. Make sure we're about good. Okay. All right. Thank you all for bearing with me while I try and read 3 stories in a row on a dry throat here. Also, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the names of your characters or your usernames and stuff. Like I said, I'm doing my best, but some of these I didn't have time to look up the phonetics on before starting. So, let's see. What are we up to? Oh, right. First place and the gold medal for Iron Author PonyFest 3.0. That is going to be May God Bless Your Soul by Seer. This one was nearly uncontested among all of our judges. Everyone was like, yeah, this is pretty good, and put it right at the top of everyone's slate. So I think this one was very well liked. I personally, there's some very meta inspiration at the beginning. It asked the question, is writing art, very early on, which is a question that was literally asked as we were starting this contest. So I appreciate that. Some inspiration directly from life. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the story. May God Bless Your Soul by Sear. But how did they write? Rarity asked, and Twilight couldn't help herself. She burst into laughter, which only intensified when Rarity's expression turned it to a look of flushed look of outrage. Eventually, though, even Rarity joined in. No, I'm serious. I'm genuinely interested in what they wrote on. Well, you know hippogriffs can walk on land, don't you, Rarity? Twilight teased, and received a light swat on her shoulder with a rolled-up magazine. Yes, thank you. Now answer the question. Jokes aside, it's actually fascinating. Hippogriff texts don't require any medium but the sea itself. Their magic could actually create permanent ripples in the water that they could then read. They literally decorated their whole world with stories and plays. Rarity murmured through a mouthful of tea. Sounds like it'd be a nightmare to translate. Oh, you have no idea. With how rare Hippogriffian works are, and all the legends surrounding this one in particular, well, let's just say getting a hold of it wasn't easy, but this thesis I'm working on is worth it. Let me ask, do you think that a writer is an artist? Doesn't everyone? Rarity asked. See, this is the thing. Most ponies would probably say that, but how often do great writers of history get listed among the greatest artists? I don't think they do nearly enough. Writing is art. I want to show ponies that. I think that sounds wonderful, Twilight, Rarity said with a small smile, the one she always got when Twilight got passionate about her work. You said there were legends about this piece? Twilight looked at the manuscript for a moment and considered how to put her thoughts into words without sounding alarmist. Or even worse, alarmist. It's one of the best-known Hippogriffian texts, but for the wrong reasons. It's said that anyone who reads the story goes mad. Rarity didn't respond for a moment, but rather took to studying the book on her table. Her eyes had turned from curious to unsettled. The room's atmosphere was cooler than before. Obviously it's not true, Twilight insisted with a roll of her eyes. If you say so. Rarity, there are plenty of scholars who have analyzed parts of the text, and they've all been fine. I think there was some plague of madness that followed all of them. I would have heard about it by now. I certainly don't think that the princess would have a copy in her archives. Okay, Rarity replied. Come on, Rarity. I'm sure those scholars read the whole thing, not just the parts they've written about. Twilight, Rarity injected, holding her hopes up. It's up to you. I'm not the one reading it. I'm sure you know what you're doing. It's just such a silly legend, Twilight huffed, looking at the book again. And ponies reacting this way, it's just, there's no need for it. Reacting in what way? Like something's going to happen. Twilight, we've seen a night queen from legend come to life. We imprisoned a serpent of chaos in stone just a few months ago, Rarity replied, chewing her bottom lip. I meant what I said. I'm sure you know what you're doing, but is it totally ridiculous to believe something like that could be real? This is different, Rarity. Someone wrote this hundreds of years ago. I can't even find a name on record. What artist could be less appreciated in history than them? I owe it to them, and I'm not going to go mad. As I said, Twilight, Rarity said quietly, it's up to you. Queen Vinia stared out into the crowd, waving elegantly as they screamed with applause. The queen is dead! The queen is dead, Alex muttered from beside her. Long live the queen, Vinia replied. Twilight pinched the bridge of her muzzle and yawned. She had been reading the story for hours now, ever since she got in. From downstairs she could hear the sounds of Spike working in the kitchen. The piece was a political intrigue, following the young Princess Vinia. Twilight had just reached the part where she had killed her tyrannical mother with the help of her close advisor, Alex, and assumed the throne herself. The subtext was clear and beautifully written. A queen who killed for her throne couldn't expect to hold on to it idly. Twilight! Spike yelled from the doorway, making Twilight yelp in shock. Twilight, Spike yelled from the doorway, making Twilight yelp in shock. Spike, what have I told you about doing that? She yelled through gasps of breath. Well, what have I told you about not listening when I shout you for dinner? I worked hard on this. Okay, she acquiesced. Point taken. She stood up and stretched, noting all of her joints popping with satisfaction. She made her way down the stairs, and with every step, the smell of Spike's cooking got stronger. Oh, wow, Spike, she said, mouth agape as she reached the table. You're really spoiling me. I enjoy it, he laughed. There's something about making something from all the constituent parts, like All these veggies are pretty boring raw, right? But like this seasoned and arranged, it's like art, Twilight interjected. You really think so? He asked, looking taken aback. Well, why not? A painter starts off with just separate colors, right? The writer starts off with all the random words. We put them together, right, and it can make us feel things we never thought before. He smiled at the praise and turned to look at his meal. She giggled. He was never very good at accepting praise. The two of them ate in a satisfied silence, thick with contemplation and appreciation. It was delicious. Twilight turned over and groaned. Her stomach made another ominous noise halfway between a grumble and a moan for the 10th time in as many minutes. The meal had indeed been amazing, but so indescribably rich. She might have eaten a touch too much, and now was paying the price. After a few more minutes' silence spent in discomfort and pain, Twilight surrendered to the fact that she wasn't going to get any work done. She pulled off her duvet and tiptoed over to her desk. Careful not to wake up Spike, she lit the candles and opened her book. She could at least spend the time being somewhat useful. She read a bit more after her meal, and had left it with Vinia being taken ill after her coronation banquet. Vinia finally lifted her head from the chamber pot when her stomach was at last emptied. Her handmaidens ran in immediately to damp her sweaty brow and clear away the foul-smelling vomit. "Bring me my chef," Vinia said, her breathing shallow. "I wish to speak with them immediately." "Your Majesty, I don't wish to speak out of turn, but it wasn't your chef who made the meal, remember?" said Astaci, the most experienced of her servants. "What? Who was it then?" "Alex." Twilight doubled over as a particularly painful groan shot through her stomach. Her eye twitched. Something felt weird. She set the book down and turned, slowly, until her eye came to rest on Spike. He was fast asleep, a contented smile on his face. No doubt deep and sweet, honeyed dreams. How funny was it that he was clearly feeling fine while Twilight felt like this? She continued to stare for a moment, until she finally just laughed at the absurdity of it all. Just too much to eat. That was it. "Spike!" Twilight yelled from the doorway. "Can you please try to be more quiet? I'm trying to concentrate." She grumbled and trudged back to her desk. She'd been reading all day, and it hadn't occurred to her until now just how loud Spike was. All the time, before meals, he'd make noise cooking. After them, he'd make noise cleaning. Then he'd come to bed and make noise as he was sleeping. All the time. Noise and noise and noise and noise. Like he was trying to drive her mad. "1,000 pardons again, my queen," Alex said, bowing her head low. "I've always loved cookery, and wanted to try and make your coronation night special, but that was no excuse. I should have left the more experienced chefs to do their work. My flights of fancy should never endanger the queen of all hippogriffs." "Do not worry yourself, my closest advisor," Vinia replied, hoping the way her fins tensed went unnoticed. "Now I was hoping we could change up our schedule today." "In what way, my queen?" Alex asked carefully. "Is it not important that I find a suitable match soon? Should we not be devoting time to this?" Vinia said, affecting a calm, dispassionate air. "My queen, your mother left the Empire in a precarious condition. We simply must focus on more pressing things first. But, as I said, my queen, all things will come in time, but we have matters that must be seen to first." Vinia nodded. Of course, had she wanted to overrule Alex, she could have, but she had already learned what she needed to know. Her stomach twinged again, and she stifled a slight moan of pain. How curious that the advisor that was currently her successor didn't want Vinia to be matched, and to produce a true heir. "Twilight?" Spike asked softly, and Twilight shrieked. Sorry, I knew you've been working and I thought I'd bring your food up here." Twilight's heart thundered as she collected herself. The whole time she stared at Spike. She'd just eaten too much. "That's okay," she replied, mouth dry. I'm not hungry." "I feel so bad. I don't know what happened yesterday. Maybe I went a bit overboard with the spices. Dragon stomachs can take the hit. I wanted to experiment a bit, but my experiment should never put you in danger." Twilight's eye twitched. Spike took the meal from her and started towards the door. The whole time, Twilight watched him. Some baseless feeling of panic scratched at the back of her mind. "Hey, Spike," Twilight called out, "how would you feel about culinary school? In Canterlot? I mean, if you really love this cooking stuff, it could be good for you." "I don't know, Twi. I mean, with what happened today, who's going to run the library when stuff happens to you?" "Happens to me?" "Yeah, like if you get ill again." "Again?" she whispered, never breaking eye contact. Spike shuffled around for a second, clearly uncomfortable and confused. "I'll just let you get back to it. I hope you're feeling better tomorrow, though. I ordered some nightshader apples." What are those? Twilight asked, her pulse quickening. Oh, you've not heard of them. They're these insanely rare apples. Only grow in the polar north, you know, where there's no sunlight. They're jet black and they're supposed to be amazing. I thought we could have them for breakfast. They're going to knock you dead. He laughed before heading out of the room. Twilight stared after him for a moment, the feeling of panic returning and intensifying. It was so stupid, so ridiculous. And yet... She turned back to the book, feeling drawn by something she couldn't describe. Vinya watched Alex leave the room. She gave it a moment before calling in Astachi. Please fetch the captain of the guard. I believe there may be a plot on my life. The handmaiden looked stricken, but she kept her decorum. Wordlessly, she bowed and began to leave. Oh, Astachi, Vinya called after her. Please make sure this information doesn't reach Alex. Twilight was underwater, but she wasn't drowning. It wasn't that she couldn't breathe, it was more that she didn't have to. The palace of the hippogriffs was a marvelous thing, all spirals of coral encrusted with jewels. She was high, up near the ceiling, and beneath her, as the rest of the palace slept, a single cloaked figure rushed through the halls. Twilight glided after them, watching as they snuck around corners and ducked through doorways. The whole time, Twilight kept her pursuit. Neither walls, nor speed, nor sight was an obstacle. Wherever the assailant went, Twilight followed. Finally, they seemed to reach their final destination. It was Twilight's cellar, an exact replica of it. This didn't make any sense. On the table, near Twilight's glassware and reagent stores, were 2 apples, black as midnight. Twilight's eye twitched. And when the figure took a syringe and filled one of the apples with poison, the one on Twilight's favorite plate, finally Twilight could feel the effects of all that water around her. Finally did it feel like she was drowning. And before she slipped away, when the hood was lowered, it was no hippogriff. No, beneath the cloak was a small dragon, purple, green, and laughing. Twilight gasped for breath as she awoke from the dream. She threw the bedclothes off and clambered out of bed, heart hammering. She left the room and hurried downstairs. Sure enough, on the table, already set up, were 2 jet black apples. Tears clouded her vision, sadness competed with fear, and both fell victim to rage, eclipsing everything. The last thing she had read in the story was how Vinya had made moves to capture Alex. Wasn't it funny how art was so indebted to real life? If the author was here, she would have laughed and cried and praised their work and asked them about it and strangled them to death and screamed. Twilight shook her head. Vinya had made moves to capture Alex. Twilight took the apples and made her way to the cellar. Vinya, think about what you're doing. We are sisters. I would never hurt you. Have you gone mad? Twilight listened to the clanging downstairs as she took in the writing on the page. The plot culminated. The book revealed its horrific climax as the executioner took Alex's head, her despicable, duplicitous, murderous, traitor head. Twilight? I brought your apple, Spike said uncertainly from behind her. It's on the purple plate. I know that's your favorite. He placed on the desk and the 2 of them were silent for a moment. Should I bring mine up and we can have it together? She turned to him and her eye twitched. No, I have work to do. Oh, he said, giving her a moment to change her mind before finally turning to leave the room. Well, just give me a shout if you need anything. For a moment, as she watched him go, a tiny part of her felt like she should call out to him, but the majority of her felt nothing at all. She took her apple and bit into it as she carried on reading, and as she digested the words, something began to twitch in her stomach. My lady, Astachi piped up, disturbing Vinya as she tried to read. Your soldiers, they found poison in the chef's headquarters. He admitted to trying to poison you. Are you saying... You mean... Alex? Vinya said, feeling sick to her stomach. Astachi didn't respond, and the room felt enormous all of a sudden. Twilight's stomach dropped. She placed the apple on her plate and closed the book. Spike? She called out. But the library was silent. All right. So once again, congratulations to our first place winner, Seer with May God Bless Your Soul. So that story definitely went a little dark, especially compared to the last one, but I think a lot of us really liked it on the judging panel, and apparently a lot of those of you that read it during the normal rating round also liked it too. So once again, congratulations to all our winners. Thank you all for sitting through these award ceremonies, listening to these stories. I've now, and actually slightly a while ago, there's now a read all entries on the Iron Author page here. So if you go to Iron Author, you don't even need to be logged in. You can click read all entries and you can see all the stories. So this is your chance to actually view what your other contestants and fellow authors wrote, discuss it with them, have fun. Hopefully a lot of you will take these stories, polish them up a little bit, maybe see them on Thin Fiction soon. So let me go one last time over to the question channel, see if there's anything that you guys want to ask before we wrap it up here. Oh, I want to remind everyone, if you enjoyed Iron Author, I thank you. I want to congratulate all of you for participating, even if you didn't win. It truly is a monumental feat to write a whole story in 2 hours, and we had a lot we had to get through. So a lot of you did an amazing job for such a short time, especially some of you that have not written in this sort of compressed time frame before, or not even written ponyfic before. There's at closing ceremonies, they'll probably mention it, but there's going to probably be a feedback survey for attendees like there was for the past two. If you really liked some panels and not others and stuff like that, let us know on the feedback so we can do a better job next time, including what you liked, what you didn't like about this, including my horrible mispronunciation of every character's name, I believe. So, all right, one last second here. Let me see if there was any last questions. I don't think so, because I don't think there should be too many questions on this. No, I will. Yeah, the scores, if you check to have your score emailed, I will be sending those out in the next day or two. I have to manually format an email, make sure the email blast is going to go to everyone appropriately, and not get flagged as spam, hopefully, and stuff. So I'll send it out in the next couple of days. Feel free to bug me if you don't see it after that. Unfortunately, because it is a mass email launch, sometimes it does get snagged by spam filter some places. But otherwise, yeah, feel free to ask me with any more specific questions. Until then, for the winners, I will be contacting you, maybe not tonight because I'm exhausted, but in the next day or so to figure out where to send your prizes to, and if you need them in a currency other than US. So, closing ceremonies will be starting in just a minute, and yeah, once again, thank you all for participating, and I will be around for a few more hours tonight on the chat channels and stuff, but I'll also be watching music and relaxing a bit, so I may be a little slow to respond, but I will get around to it. All right. We will be going off the air in a second. Thank you all once again. Iron Author. Woo!